Welcome to the Plant-Free MD podcast with Dr. Anthony Chafee, where we discuss diet and nutrition and how this affects health and chronic disease, and show you how you can use this to optimize your health and happiness, both mentally and physically. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Anthony Chafee again with another episode of Plant-Free MD. Today I have a very special guest, Mr. Ben Azadi. Ben, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Doc, thank you so much for having me on your show. I love the work that you're doing. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. I really do like yours as well. For those who don't know you, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah. So I grew up in Miami Beach, Florida, where I currently live, and I love it here. And I followed a standard American diet like so many people. And we know it's a processed diet with Franken foods. And I didn't know any better growing up. My parents immigrated here from Iran, and I was left to my own devices growing up. So of course I ate a lot of fast food and hung around the wrong crowd. My mom actually worked at Kentucky Fried Chicken as a kid. So she would bring me home fried chicken all the time, cooked in good old seed oils. And I ate that, doing the best that I can do. And my mom doing the best that she could do. But I was a kid who had very low self-confidence, and I was obese actually for most of my life. I was overweight and obese. I was bullied and picked on, but not just physically obese, but mentally obese. I had a lot of mental issues and addictions to sugar and video games and drugs. And I found myself as an adult now, 24 years old, back in 2008, hitting rock bottom, being in a very dark place. Ex-girlfriend broke up with me, never really studied health and nutrition. My body was out of control. My health was out of control. I weighed 250 pounds at that point. I had 34% body fat, classified as actually being physically obese, but I was actually suicidal, Anthony. I was on the internet looking for ways to end my life, and I was just tired of hurting and crying every day. And I thought that was the easiest way to just end the suffering. And every time I explored suicide, I kept thinking about my mother. And man, if I would have taken my life, what would my mom have to deal with, the devastation to her? I didn't want to do that to her. So it stopped me. And I knew I had to figure things out, but it was a vicious cycle because I was exploring suicide, stopping myself back and forth for months, until my best friend handed me a book. And, some people say, one book can't change your life, but I'm here to tell you, one book did change my life. It opened up the door for a second book and a fifth book and a 20th book. So I started to read books from authors like Dr. Wayne Dyer and Tony Robbins and Bob Proctor and Earl Nightingale and all these incredible people. And it did a lot for me. It opened up a whole new world I never knew existed. But the most important thing the books did for me was actually help me take ownership and responsibility for the first time ever. I had the victim mindset like you've never seen before. I was blaming my genetics, my enabling family members, my slow metabolism. It's their fault. It's this person's fault. It's not my fault. But the cool thing, the amazing thing about taking responsibility is that all that goes away. And the meaning of that word responsibility is your ability to respond to life. And my ability to respond to life up until that point was very poor. But when I decided to take ownership, it improved. And I immediately stopped being the victim of my history. And I was determined to become the victor of my destiny. And that's where I put my foot down, took responsibility, changed my nutrition, moved my body. And in 9 months after declaring that responsibility, I lost 80 pounds. I went from 250 pounds to 170 pounds. I went from 34% body fat to 6% body fat. Finally achieved this physical six-pack. But the most important thing that I achieved was a mental six-pack and what it did for my mental health. And it just got me curious because this was in 2008. And I transitioned from my 9-to-5 job to becoming a personal trainer because I was just so fascinated with fitness and nutrition. And I have just been a student of health and nutrition ever since then for 14 years, exploring like the vegan diet, exploring the carnivore diet, the keto diet, and kind of taking what worked and throwing away what didn't work. And I just constantly am learning and studying, and I just love it. So fast forward to today, my company is called Keto Kamp, Kamp with a K. We are a global brand, and we have platforms on social media. Podcasts are coming on mine soon, and I have 4 books. So I just want to learn and then educate as many people as possible. So the mission is to educate and to inspire 1 billion people and to wake them up and help them take ownership and responsibility like I did myself.
Well, that's awesome, man. I mean, that's a really great mission. And, it's great that when Well, you can just pass on that information in the first place. And, coming from a place that you actually had to go through it yourself, that gives it a lot of credibility as well, because you've been there, you've seen it, you were in desperate, in desperate situation and you were able to get out of it. And so you can actually help people get out of it as well. And that's really great that you want to do that for other people. So well done with that, man. That's great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Tell us about your books. You have 4 books now. What do those cover and what are you trying to get across with those?
Yeah, the first book is called Perfect Health Booklet, a simple book. I actually got inspired to write it because of Grant Cardone. Do you know who Grant Cardone is? Are you familiar with him?
I don't think I've come across him yet.
Yeah, he's an American entrepreneur. He has the movement called 10X movement. 10X rule, but
yes. No, I have. Yeah.
Him. So
I've half read that book. Yeah. So far.
It's a great book, but
yeah,
he wrote something called mine is called Perfect Health Booklet. His was called the Millionaire Booklet. So it's he wrote it to kind of break down health for like a teenager can understand finances. I wrote it to break down health. So his was finances, mine was health. So I got the idea of like just putting together the principles of health in a small little booklet. And that's where the Perfect Health Booklet came about. And I wrote that in 2008. After that, I started to really get into intermittent fasting and different variations of fasting. I wrote a book just answering the top 20 questions on fasting called the Intermittent Fasting Cheat Sheet. And then I got really fascinated with sleep and all the amazing processes that take place during sleep. So I wrote a book called The Power of Sleep. But then my latest book, which is the book I'm most proud of, is called Keto Flex. And that book took me a couple years to write. It outlines like the 4 pillars that I teach my students. And it has been endorsed by Dr. Fung and Dr. Ben Bickman and Dr. Mindy Pels and a lot of great leaders in our space. And I'm very proud of it. So that's the main book that I focus on now, which is called Keto Flex.
Awesome. And so those 4 pillars, what are those? Like what does the book encompass as well?
So the book has those 4 pillars laid out. Before we even get to it in the book, I share my story about being unhealthy. I also lost my dad to the complications of type 2 diabetes in 2014. So I share that story as well. Yeah, and that has been a big driver for me too, because up until losing my dad, I was kind of treating health and teaching health like a hobby. And then I lost my dad and then it became like a purpose and a real commitment. So really there was a blessing in that pain, like there always is in pain. So I talk about that in the book and what went wrong with my dad and how, I followed conventional wisdom and how it led down a wrong path for me and my dad. And we all suffered as a result. And diabetes type 2s, you can definitely reverse it and there's things you can do. So I talk about that. And then I just get into like the main principles of health and as we understand it. And then I'll get into ketosis. So the first pillar in my 4-pillar approach is called adapt. And that means getting fat adapted, right? As you know, that is the goal, to be an efficient fat burner. Most Americans, most people in the world are sugar burners. They're stuck burning glucose, and that is very inflammatory. It's going to create a lot of free radicals. It's going to age you faster. So we want to get them fat adapted. We want to get them into ketosis. So I talk about how to do that. I have principles to get people from burning sugar to burning fat in like 14 days and how to verify that by testing. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is called fast, because then after the person is fat adapted, then we introduce intermittent fasting and intermittent fasting strategies. So it's not just one regular fasting schedule. We do different schedules. We do a little bit of OMAD, alternate day fasting, some days where we don't fast. We just keep the body kind of adapting and guessing. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar you're going to love because it's called phase, and we're phasing out all these plants, right? Nice. You're like talking all about these anti-nutrients. So we're phasing out all these anti-nutrients, these phytates, these lectins, these oxalates, so we could really get some deep healing, force the mitochondria to really use ketones and heal the gut. The fourth pillar you might not like, I don't know, but it's called flex. And at that point, the goal, I believe, is to teach people to become metabolic flexibility. So we don't have to do keto long-term. We could strategically flex out, like women who have a menstrual cycle. The week before their cycle is the best week to have healthy carbs and flex in and out. So the goal is to teach them metabolic flexibility. And that's what the pillars are outlining. So it takes them about 3 to 4 months to achieve that flex pillar. And those are the 4 main pillars that I teach in there.
Awesome. And so with that flex pillar, what do you find the advantages to coming in and out of keto, especially cyclically for women's menstruation?
Yeah. So what I've seen, and I work with like 45 different practitioners and doctors. So Dr. Mindy Pels is in there, Dr. Pampa, and a whole bunch of others. And we've done a lot of case studies. We meet every Tuesday and we go over like lab work and case studies. So what we've seen is that the week before the period is a very important week to build progesterone. And of course, it's hard to do that when we're doing a lot of fasting and keto, but there's some carbohydrates that could actually be the building blocks for progesterone. And then once that menstrual cycle comes, the bleed week, we could go right back to ketosis, right back to fasting, be more aggressive. So we've seen that. And then just anecdotally, I've heard from tons of clients that are women who have a menstrual cycle that they get all these cravings the week before their period when they're strict keto or strict carnivore. And to me, it's like kind of like the innate intelligence giving them clues that maybe you need to have some carbs to make those hormonal conversions. So that is the main premise behind it, to build progesterone for a healthy monthly cycle, menstrual cycle.
Hey guys, just want to take a second to thank our sponsor, Carnivore Bar. I don't promote many products because honestly, all you need to be healthy is to just eat meat. For those times that you're out hiking, road tripping, or stuck at work and you want a nutritious snack that is just meat, fat, and salt if you want it, the Carnivore Bar is a great option. So I like this product not because it's just pure meat, but also because I want the carnivore market to thrive as well. And the more we support meat-only products, the more meat-only products there will be available in the mainstream. So if this sounds like something you'd like to get behind, check it out using my discount code Anthony to get 10% off, which also applies to subscriptions, giving you 25% off total. All right. Thanks, guys.
Okay. All right, cool. And you've done, well, yeah, I guess you've done some blood work. Have you done that with like people that are just like doing just keto or just carnivore without the fasting? They're still getting a lot of food and probably making carbohydrates themselves. You find that they need a little bit more?
I do, but some people don't, right? So it's, as you know, it's so individualized. So there's ways to do the flexing without having to have the carbohydrates. It could just be a high caloric day or a high protein day. So we use those tools as well. And some people have sugar addiction, carb addiction. So we don't want them to just say, hey, have more carbs. That'll open up, a door we don't want open. So there's ways to get around it. But in general, for most women who don't have addictions, we do have them have healthy carbs as long as they're metabolically flexible. We have them do that first before we implement the flex days.
Okay. And for guys, what are the advantages that you found there?
So for guys, what I've seen in terms of like lab work is not for everybody. Like I've seen guys be more aggressive and thrive with long-term ketosis and carnivore. So this is not for everybody, but I've seen some guys have wonky thyroid numbers. I've seen the TSH go up, reverse T3 go up, and I've seen their sex hormone binding globulin go up and naturally lowering their testosterone. And by just having them do a 1 day per week where they just flex out with healthy carbs, I've seen that help those markers. But again, that's not for every guy, but that's just to give you an example.
And you said some of the flexibility, you could just have a higher caloric intake day. So it was just eating a lot more meat or whatever. Does that confer similar outcomes?
Yeah, that could definitely be doable, right? So just the high protein day, like make it an mTOR day or a high caloric day, no fasting. The goal is to mix things up and keep the body guessing.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And when you originally lost all this weight, was that through ketosis or what was your strategy at that time?
So I did it the way that I wouldn't teach it to this day because it was more like excessive, like calorie counting and exercising and lower fat. So I lost the weight, but I wasn't healthy, right? As you know, being fit is not equal to being healthy. So I was one of those fit, sick people. I had digestive issues. So I still was trying to explore what true cellular health felt like, because it wasn't that, even though I was 6%, 7% body fat. So I explored different diets. One of them was the vegan diet, right? And this is back in 2012, where I remember watching some documentaries, not really understanding how to interpret science and all that, but watching some documentaries and then reading the China study. And the China study duped me and convinced me that this is the way, plants are the way to save humanity and save your health. Yeah. So I went full in to a plant-based diet, 100%. And man, a few months into it, it felt so off. I was doing CrossFit at that time. I owned a CrossFit gym at that time. I was recovering, taking me 5 days to recover from a workout. Energy levels were fluctuating. I was gaining weight, but I was so dogmatic that I stuck with it for 15 months until I said, I got to do some lab work. And then the lab work verified how I was feeling. Now this is 2013. then I said, I got to make a change. And that's actually when I discovered ketosis and fasting. And so I went from being a vegan to ketosis and fasting in 2013.
Oh, very good. And then how did you come across, what are you doing at the current moment? Is that mostly keto? Do you do carnivore now, or what's your dietary plan at this point for yourself?
Personally, I do really well with meat. Like you, I thrive when I eat meat. I'll share my story about when I first did carnivore, because I was writing my book. I was beginning of it, and I had the 4 pillars, but the phase pillar that I mentioned is now carnivore. Wasn't carnivore before I wrote the book. It was more just really low carb, like 10 grams a day, but it wasn't necessarily carnivore. But then I started hearing all of these amazing stories about carnivore helping with this autoimmune condition, with brain fog, with fat loss. I mean, you've seen it yourself. Mm-hmm. So I thought, okay, this could be there's something here. Let me do it first. So my first experiment was 3.5 years ago, where I said, I'm going to do carnivore for 40 straight days. But before I do, I'm going to do comprehensive lab work. So I went to LabCorp on day 1. I did a full thyroid panel. I did, of course, insulin, A1C, LDL particles, a full lipid panel, CBC, everything. And then I did 40 days of carnivore. But going into carnivore, I would get some autoimmune flare-ups maybe every week or so. I have Raynaud's, so my Raynaud's would flare up, and it had been getting progressively better over the years as my health has been getting better, but I still got flare-ups. When I did carnivore, those 40 days, I only had 2 small Raynaud's flare-ups the entire time, which was like, oh my gosh, this is like amazing because it's showing my body's in a healing state. Not only that, I felt great. My brain was just so mentally sharp and focused. My skin complexion got better. I lost some body fat. But then it was like, okay, day 40, let's do the same lab work. And I did the same exact lab work on day 40 before I broke it. Everything improved. My C-reactive protein went from 1.1 on day 1 to 0.5. I lost a point off my A1C. My fasting insulin dropped. My thyroid markers looked better. My homocysteine improved. It was just like, it verified how I felt. So that's where I was like, there's something here with carnivore. And that's where I decided to put it into my book. So I'm not 100% carnivore, but I'm mostly animal based. Right now, I'm doing strict carnivore for this month with my students. We're doing it for the month of January, but I would say 80 to 90% of the meals I eat consist of meat because I feel good with it.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And that's definitely something that you see with autoimmune, especially. Like that's something that just responds so well to carnivore, but really just eliminating out all of these things that they can trigger inflammation. They can trigger an autoimmune response. And so, especially if you're sensitive to that sort of thing, it's such a great tool to beat your issues. And some of these treatments for autoimmune issues, while they can be very helpful, and when we didn't really, know any better, it sort of gave people a bit of their life back. But they're quite heavy. They're quite serious medications, and you have a big flare up. When you have to take steroids and things like that, like that's very hard on your system. Yeah, and being able to just control that just with the food you eat, I think that's very liberating for people.
It's a blessing. It's such a blessing. And I'm sure you see it all the time with people with autoimmune. And we know autoimmune is everywhere. People have autoimmune. They don't even know they have autoimmune. It takes years for it to be diagnosed. So to be able to change the symptoms and get those symptoms to go away, essentially, with just changing your nutrition without having to go through those extreme measures, it's such a powerful tool. Yeah,
absolutely. So you're doing that with your students, presumably for Carnivore Month. What are some of the benefits? Have people been talking about their results with that so far?
Yeah, we have some students who have rosacea, and they've seen some improvements with their rosacea, psoriasis as well. We have people who say that their digestion just feels better. When I do carnivore, I get no gas. I eat carbs, I'll get gas sometimes. But so we have some students who say the same thing. And then we have some students who say, they're a little constipated. There's some troubleshooting there naturally. So we have them do some things. But in general, we have a whole thread in our Facebook group, and we have people posting their meals every day, giving us their progress report, sharing their glucose and ketones. And most people are feeling really good with it. So yeah, it's been a huge success.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Usually I find when people are getting constipated, they just increase their fat. That usually takes care of it. Yeah. And, but that's such an easy thing to to have to play around with as well, because, people are so used to eating like different amounts of fat, and they say like, well, I'm eating so much more fat, that must be enough. And it's just like, well, actually you need to eat more. And it just blows their mind, because like we've been eaing lean for our whole lives. It's been 50 years that people have been saying, like, don't eat fat, don't eat fat. And so it's really ingrained in there. So I remember talking to a guy I worked with that was trying it out, and he's like, oh, I'm constipated. I was like, well, that means you need to eat more fat. It's like, no, I'm definitely eating more enough fat. And you take a look at what he's eating, and I mean, it's more than like say a normal portion, but it was barely anything. And I was like, look, if you're constipated, like on carnivore, like by definition, you're not eating enough fat, because your body's absorbing all of it. You need to get a little bit of excess to get that out. But yeah, it's cool that you're bringing that on for your students too. I mean, you've got a huge platform, so obviously you can reach a lot of people. And I think this is very exciting that this sort of information is becoming more and more accessible and popular, because it really does help a lot of people. Where do you think that you want to go from here? So you just published your book, Keto Flex. Obviously, that's going to make a big impact on people. And now you've come around to carnivore as well through that book. What is your game plan for reaching your 1 billion people? How do you want to get out there and get this message out there?
Well, conversations like this, Anthony, that's why I'm grateful to be on your platform, because you have a huge platform too. You're doing great work, and you're growing very fast, and it's so well deserved. So just more conversations like this. Yeah, absolutely. You're doing great things. It's essentially I've seen people just lack the belief that their body was built to heal itself. And I just want them to understand how incredible the human body is. Like, I'm a strong believer in God, but we could substitute that word for whatever words you feel comfortable with. But, I always say you are a masterpiece because you are a piece of the master. Like, your body was built to thrive. And there's essentially, in the book, I talk about 3 ways to heal the body. And number 1, it is just to identify the interference. Number 1. Number 2, remove the interference. And number 3, allow your body to heal, because we have this inner physician that is eager to go to work for us, this innate intelligence that is the world's greatest physician or doctor or chiropractor. There's no pill, surgery, shot, or anything that could substitute the innate intelligence, but we've blocked it. So we've been brainwashed to believe, and I know you know this, that disease and symptoms are evil, and we should hate them, and we should mask them, and use medication and whatever surgery. But diseases and symptoms are actually a gift from the innate intelligence. Like, thank God the human body has a check engine light. If not, we would just be so confused and we would just die. But the fact that we have the ability to have a disease or a symptom is a beautiful thing, because it's giving us clues that the body is out of homeostasis. Something is blocking the innate intelligence. So we have to identify what that is. And for a lot of people, of course, it's the food they're eating. It's the anti-nutrients, it's the seed oils, it's the wheat, it's the gluten, but it's also the things we're putting in our mind, the thoughts that we're thinking, the 60,000 thoughts that we have per day. And it's also the environment, because that's everything is epigenetics. It's an environmental stimulus that tells your DNA nucleus to perform a job. If that environmental stimulus is a positive stimulus, then the genetics, the genes that are turned on are fantastic genes, or you could thrive. But if it's a negative stimulus, whether it's a negative thought, an inflammatory food, or an environmental toxin, then the protein that is produced from the DNA is inflammatory. So I just want to educate so many people to help them believe in the innate intelligence, believe in the body, and see symptoms and diseases as a blessing and a gift, not a curse. So I just want to do have more conversations like this and speak on more stages and just reach as many people as possible. That's the goal.
Awesome. Yeah. And I totally agree with you. We are meant to thrive. We are a very, very robust and powerful species. And I remember when I was a kid looking around at different animals in the wild and thinking, like, why are we the only squishy animal on Earth? Like, all these animals in the wild, they're ripped, they're just so muscular and massive. And, the answer, to my childish question was, well, they exercise a lot. They're always running around and doing things. And I was like, okay, I accepted it at the time. But then later, I noticed that, animals in the zoo are pretty ripped too. And they're not getting any exercise, so that didn't make any sense, and I think it does come down down to the food that we eat, but simply put, if you talk to a zookeeper and you and you feed them things that they don't eat in the wild, they'll tell you they get human diseases. And this is why you have signs at the zoo and signs at the park saying, don't feed the animals. It makes them sick. And I've always thought that was funny, even before I had my epiphany with human nutrition. I just thought it was hilarious that people had these signs that said, don't feed the animal the thing that you're eating. Right. This is poison.
So true. You're so right. Yeah. I never even thought about that. You're so right, dude. Yeah.
But it was always funny to me. And, and domesticated pets, the vets will tell you that there's an increased prevalence in animals getting human diseases. So, it's not a human disease, it's from the food, obviously. So if you eat the food, then you get a human disease. And that's exactly what we're doing. We used to call that diseases of the West, Western civilizations with agriculture would get those same diseases than these other populations that we would see that were just eating, like a, hunter, really maybe hunter gatherer sort of lifestyle, but a lot of meat, they would just get that. They wouldn't get those diseases. And, you'd have to thrive in those situations because they're rough situations, like the Maasai don't eke by, like they fight lions with sticks and they win, like you have to be thriving and very healthy to survive that, through the ice ages. You're not just barely getting through an ice age. You have to be just killing it and thriving during an ice age, or you're dead. You and all your family and everyone are dead. And so, I think that's a very good point, that we are designed to thrive. We are meant to be so healthy just on our own. We think that everyone is just decaying and dying and breaking down. And it's just this miracles of modern medicine and pharmaceutical technology. They're just holding us together. And we're just this shaky, rattly machine that's just trying to fall apart. We're not, we're a Learjet. We should be just flying the whole time. And so I like that statement. I think we are absolutely meant to thrive.
Well said. Yeah, 100%. The average man would not survive in the ice ages for like a day right now. We're just so easy to kill. And that's not the goal. We don't want to be easy to kill. It's just brainwashing. There was this woman who's working for the United States government who just came on 60 Minutes here in the United States last week. And she was talking about obesity, right? And she was saying that it has nothing to do with sleep or nutrition. It's about the genes you have. It's like, are you kidding me? That's the message you're still giving people in the world population. It's so backwards. It's criminal, essentially.
Well, and she damn well knows better. I mean, what an absurd thing to say. I think I didn't see her whole argument, but I remember, I think she said, that it runs in families, that obesity runs in families. And if your family is obese, then you have 75% chance of being obese, something like that. And it's just like, well, obviously, because you live with people, you learn their habits and you're eating dinner with them, of course, if your parents are eating things that are going to make them a certain way, you're eating the same thing. And that's why type 2 diabetes runs in families more so than type 1 diabetes. But all you have to do is simply look at this. If it was purely genetic, then it would be consistent throughout time, right? Because that's how that works, and, it's just like, blue eyes are genetic, it's not like, if you're eating, Twinkies at 7, your eyes are going to change, from blue to green or something like that. Not that I know of. I've never heard of that. And, and so you see those genes throughout the population genetics, they're consistent throughout time. And the obesity rate is absolutely not consistent over time. In America and the UK, the obesity rate after World War II was 6%. In 1980 in the UK, it was 6%. In the US, it was 8%. Started to creep up at that point. Now it's like 24%, in a couple decades, right? So it's been very consistent. And before World War II, it was roughly around 6% as well, since we've been keeping track of these sorts of things. So it's actually been very consistent before that. And then we started changing the way we ate dramatically, and people started getting obese and getting sick. So that actually changed. That can't be genetic. And she must have studied population genetics. And is she a doctor? Is that?
I think she is.
Yeah.
Either way, it's like either she's doesn't understand genetics or she does, and she's blatantly lying for an agenda. Either way, it's wrong to give that message to so many people. And Harvard is predicting that by the year 2030, 50% of the adult American population is going to be obese. 50%. It's insane.
Yeah, well, if we don't do something about it, certainly. And type 2 diabetic right now is 9% of Americans are type 2 diabetic, and 40% are pre-diabetic, right?
Pre-diabetic,
so very soon, that's going to be 50%. And the likelihood is that it is probably going to go to that, because, I'm hoping that we can head them off at the path before they get to that point and get people to change their life. Yeah. But it's a difficult situation. She's an American doctor, then she does know population genetics, because you have to take these sorts of classes in for your prerequisites. You have to take genetics to get into medical school in America. So, it's it's par for the course. I mean, there's so many things out there that, especially, the politicians and the governments are saying that, is designed to mislead people. And, the food pyramid and all these different sorts of things, like these people are purported to be there to try to help you and guide you, but they have their own mission as well. They have their own agenda, and it may not be your health. It may be, that they're, getting paid to say something, that they have lobbyists and different sorts of influences. And it could be as simple as that. It could be something else as well. But either way, I disagree with it. I know you do too. And it just doesn't make sense. I mean, it doesn't even pass the smell test, because if it were purely genetic, then the obesity rates wouldn't have dramatically changed when we dramatically changed our diets.
Agreed. Yeah, it's not purely genetics. We know that. I mean, Dr. Bruce Lipton, who's a brilliant cell biologist, he believes 99% of all disease and symptoms, including obesity, is epigenetics. Only 1% is genetics. I don't know if it's that high, but I know that it's, I believe over 90% of it is epigenetics. And that's great, because we have control over epigenetics. Right? We have control over the expression of these genes, and there's things we can do about it. And that's not what the government or mainstream news is going to talk about, because that's not going to help make a lot of money for a lot of people, unfortunately. So the best way to understand, because there's a lot of different opinions and different diets, and we have the government and Tufts University promoting this thing, and then we have people talking about carnivore. I always tell people the best way to know how to get healthy is to just follow close attention to the government guidelines and their My Food Plate or Tufts University recommendation. Pay attention to what they're doing and just do the exact opposite. And you're going to be healthier and you're going to be happier. Just do the opposite of what they're telling you to do. Yeah,
absolutely. I saw that South Park clip recently as well. They did something where they're like, what's the food? Bring up the pyramid. And they brought up the food pyramid. They're like, but this doesn't work. It didn't this and the other. And he's like, and Cartman's just like, it's upside down, they're like, what? And they flip it around. They're, oh my God, it's a perfect match, sir. And it's just like, it was absolutely hilarious. And, but it was like true, it was funny that they did that, like that. I would agree, with Dr. Lipton. Who knows the exact number, but I think that the vast majority of the diseases that we treat, have a direct relationship to, the food that we eat. And, it's always sort of thought that you have something that can be purely genetic, right? That if you get this gene, you're going to have it. So it'd be like the penetrance of a gene. And so you have this gene, and some things will have like a 99%, 100% penetrance or something. There aren't really many things that have that, but
it's rare.
Yeah, very rare. And then you'd have, like 60% penetrance, 40% penetrance, where, if you have the gene, 40% of the time you'll get it or whatever. So there's some environmental factor that's kicking this off. And so you have the genetic predisposition, and then you have an environmental trigger. And then other things that are purely environmental, like getting your arm chopped off. Like there's nothing in your genes that's going to like predispose you to getting your arm chopped off, unless you're like, a dick or something like that, but I thought there's some things. But I'm finding more and more that like a lot of these things that we thought were pretty strongly genetic, actually have a genetic predisposition and then a trigger, like Huntington's disease. I thought that was purely genetic. Like if you get Huntington's, like you will get Huntington's disease if you have the gene. And it turns out, I'm talking to people anecdotally, but it's very promising that even with Huntington's disease, people are improving and they're holding it off, and they're actually, sort of reversing their symptoms, which is huge, because that is just a devastating illness. And if that's something that can be, suppressed and even reversed, or just never have in the first place, that would be massive, massive, massive. So I think just more and more and more, I'm finding that things are very strongly related to our diet and lifestyle.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, it's a testament to the amazing human body. We take so many hits and the body just keeps going. So the body is built so magnificently. Yeah,
definitely. So, so we go into some of the details with ketosis. What are some of the benefits of being on a ketogenic diet and ketosis in general?
I love ketosis. I call it the great land of ketosis because I just feel so damn good when I'm in ketosis. We know that all of our ancestors did keto. There's nothing new about keto. It just might be nuanced or new to somebody, but there's no fad diet about keto. It is a fact, not a fad. Our ancestors, thank God for this ability for the liver to produce ketones, because if we didn't have this ability, we probably wouldn't exist today, right, Anthony? Our ancestors would not have had a second energy source of ketones. They would not be able to go hunt and kill and stay sharp. They would have died. So by necessity, ketosis was used in terms of like a survival state, but there's a benefit to that because it's a stress to the mitochondria, and it's a beneficial stress to the mitochondria, which helps the mitochondria become more robust and create more mitochondria and more energy. So when we just look at the electron transport chain, which is the way we create energy from food and oxygen and nutrients, the electron transport chain, when somebody's in ketosis, you get about 400% more ATP molecules, more energy being produced versus somebody in ketosis. So 32 to 36 ATP molecules when you're burning sugar, 132 plus when you're using ketones. So you have this 400% increase in energy. Amazing. That's part of the reason why you feel so good. But we know the more energy you produce, the more you increase your basal metabolic rate, the more calories you burn. All good things. But at the same time, you have this uncoupling process where now these extra free radicals that are being used, these reactive oxygen species, they're being uncoupled, and the mitochondria are releasing them like release valves from a pressure cooker. So you have lower inflammation, more energy. It's like, that sounds like a win-win to me. So ketosis is just so incredible because the mitochondria, as you know, Anthony, it's very important to have healthy, robust mitochondria. Most diseases out there are linked to mitochondrial dysfunction. And ketosis is a great way, along with fasting and carnivore, to stress the mitochondria, create healthier, strong mitochondrial fitness. So you have more energy and less free radicals at the same time. So I love it for those two reasons right there.
Yeah. I would totally agree with you. I mean, we are, designed like this. I mean, we were out there eating meat, and in the ice ages, what else was there to eat except meat, And so, right. We would have been in these states all the time. And that, people say is like, is it healthy to be in ketosis a long time? It's like, well, it worked for our ancestors, it worked for, entire civilizations still living today that really just exclusively eat meat. And then all the people doing keto and Atkins and things like that for the last several decades, there are people that, from Western cultures and backgrounds that have been doing keto or in ketosis for literally decades now. And they're thriving, just like you and I are. So it's, I think it's very important to know that. And you're right. There's so many different biological pathways. I mean, I really argue that being in ketosis, that so-called fasting metabolism, I think that's really is our primary metabolism. I think the only reason we call like a fed state our primary, fed state, is because, by the time we came around to being able to look at biochemistry at a molecular level, everyone was eating carbohydrates. And they're like, oh, when you eat, it looks like this. And when you don't eat, it looks like that. Failing to recognize that if you eat anything at all except carbohydrates, it also looks like you're so-called fasting. And, if I eat 5,000 calories in ribeye, like I'm not fasting. Like that's just not a fasting state. So it has to be something else. I think that's, well, it's really, I just think it's our primary metabolic state. And that's the metabolic state of most animals in the wild. Like most animals are in that ketogenic state. And
my dog is,
Yep. Sorry? Your dog is,
exactly. Yeah. He eats, raw meat for breakfast, raw meat for dinner, and he's in ketosis in between, right? It's like, that's the way animals are meant to do it. Yeah.
That's it. That's exactly it. So yeah, it really stands to reason that our body and our biochemistry are going to work, and our cellular, subcellular body is going to work better when we're in the state that we're supposed to be in. Yeah.
We're designed to experience ketosis. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's that study that came out, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, 2018, that showed that 88% of American adults are unhealthy, which probably got worse after COVID. So whenever I lecture on stage, I'll show that study and then I'll rewrite it and say 88% of American adults are in a keto deficiency, right? If they just got them in ketosis, like they would put a dent in that stat. But we've been brainwashed to believe it's a fad diet and the standard American diet is the real diet, but that's the real fad diet. It's just a whole 180 approach. Just everything we've been taught, it's the exact opposite. It's funny
that this is a fad diet when it's the way that humans have been eating literally forever, and that the real way to eat with all these healthy options and all these different sorts of things, those foods didn't exist 100 years ago. They just flat out didn't exist. I mean, cornflakes popped up about 100 years ago. Like before that, that's it. So it always makes me, sort of laugh when people say that, we're supposed to be eating the standard American approach when those foods didn't exist 100 years ago.
They have no argument.
No.
Keto is not even a diet. It's a metabolic process. It's like,
right. Yeah.
We have just forgotten to tap into, we've lost the ability to tap into this metabolic process because babies are, babies that are breastfed are in ketosis. Yeah, there's glucose and sugar in breast milk, but the baby is so efficient at using that. The baby is in ketosis and it helps the development of that baby's brain. But what happens? The average mom, will take the baby off of breast milk and then they're given high sugar formula and then they're eating every 2 to 3 hours and they're eating high carbs. And now we took this natural fat burning baby, and that's happened to me. And now we teach them to become a sugar burner. And then we forget about this amazing process called ketosis, but it is really our natural fat burning birthright to be in this state of ketosis.
Yeah. And even like the vegetables that we're eating, like those vegetables didn't exist either. I mean, we bioengineered those as well. There was a study. I'm blanking on the name, but anyway, it was like back in like the early 1900s, and they were looking at nutrition and how this affected health and things like that. It was actually pretty interesting study for its time, and they looked at two African populations. One was the Maasai, and the other was, I can't remember the name, but anyway, it was in very close proximity to the Maasai, and they were basically whole food, vegetarian-based, plant-based anyway. And so this is exactly what, the vegetarian and vegan people will say, this is the optimal thing, which is this whole food straight from the ground, no pesticides, anything like that, and no processed food. So a perfect ideal model. And they looked at that compared to the Maasai, who were essentially just carnivore, and they eat dairy, the warriors would drink blood and they would have meat sometimes as well. But it's all animal based. And so they just looked at these two, populations that are very much, opposed to each other. But the very interesting thing is that they were related genetically because they interbred and they intermarried. And so they were quite similar. And, but they had very different diets. And what they found was that the health markers between the two were massive differences, and that the Maasai were far healthier, lived longer, were much more healthy, weren't getting sick all the time, and their height was different. Like the Maasai were on average like 6 inches taller than the other tribe, and they were like the same genetic population. Right.
Wow.
And it's like, and you get like, a tall Maasai would go over, marry someone, in this other tribe, and they'd have short kids. And then like a short person from that tribe would come over to the Maasai and have kids, and they'd have tall kids. And so it was very, very much like that epigenetic effect. And I'm sure there's further, because the epigenetics can actually go down generations. Like it can take generations to see the ultimate effect. There was a study I like to talk about called Pottinger's cats. This guy, Dr. Pottinger, in the 30s and 40s, he did this with cats, and he found that that cooked meat and raw meat had very different effects on the cats, and they were much more healthy with raw meat. And that generation down generation, the raw meat ones were just thriving, and then the cooked meat ones were just getting worse and worse and worse, and smaller brains, smaller cheekbones, smaller bodies. Bone mineral density was much lower, got down to like 3%. So their bones were like cracking and breaking just by walking around. It was very sad. And after 3 generations, they couldn't breed. They couldn't have a 4th generation. They weren't even interested in procreating, most of them. And some pregnancies that did, happen, all ended in stillbirth. And so that was it. This is like very clear, like this isn't working. And these epigenetic sort of effects. Even more interestingly is that when they got that 3rd generation of cats back onto raw meat, they became much more healthy. They were able to breed. Amazing. But their kids didn't just look like the raw meat cat. It took 4 generations to breed back to that. So it has these epigenetic effects have long lasting, generational effects.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating. It makes me wonder, like, what are we doing now? It's like to our future generation, and how long will it take to overcome the damage that has been done? That's crazy. Yeah, it's
gonna take a while. I think that like our kids are going to be much taller, have much bigger brains, be much more healthy, just congenitally than we are, which is great. And they're certainly going to, beat the pants off of everybody in their generation, So I sort of think, like, just like on a selfish side, like I should probably start having kids soon, just because, like, like by the time if I have kids now, like they're going to be at this like supreme advantage, of everyone in their peerage. And eventually, I'm trying to get this around the world, so it's going to be just the norm. So I'm like, all right, I should probably get this now, while they still have this advantage. But our kids are going to be taller and smarter with bigger brains and more athletic, which is great. And their kids are going to be even more so, as long as they hold to that, I think. Right. And so,
and then the average kid, not our kids, because we're healthy, but the average person who has kids, they're going to have like huge thumbs for their phones, and like they're going to lose the curve in their neck, and they're going to be permanently like this. It's crazy how things are going to happen.
That's funny. Yeah. I was going to ask as well. You talk about like specific sorts of benefits about ketosis just on our brains, and the benefits that can happen. What are some of the benefits of just being in ketosis or on a ketogenic diet, just for our brains and our function thereof?
Yeah, that goes back to the mitochondria, right? The mitochondria are so important that if you think about, again, I believe in God. So if you think about the human body and the way that God built the human body, the cells that are most required for survival, because that's the number one priority for the human body and the innate intelligence is survival. The cells that are most required for survival are the cells that have the most mitochondria. So the brain cells have the highest concentration of mitochondria. There are regions in the brain cells in the brain that have millions, over 2 million mitochondria in a single cell in different regions in the brain. Then we have the eyes loaded with mitochondria. We have the heart. We have the ovaries, reproduction system, thousands to tens of thousands of mitochondria, and other cells have a few hundred to a few thousand. But the ones that are most important have the most mitochondria. That's how important the mitochondria are. So we already established what ketones can do to create this mitochondrial fitness and mitogenesis. And that's going to help with the brain, because the brain has the most mitochondria. It gives your brain a fuel source, beta hydroxybutyrate, which has it's great at crossing that blood-brain barrier and giving your brain an energy source. And the argument that people make, it's very stupid. They're going to say, but the brain needs some glucose, or the body needs glucose at all times. And you know what? They're right. But what they don't get is that the body can manufacture that glucose from many different ways, right? Gluconeogenesis, the backbone of fat. So ketones can be used primarily for fuel in the brain. And beta hydroxybutyrate is one of those 3 ketone bodies. And the mitochondria are so dense up there that you feel great. So somebody who has brain fog, somebody who has mental fatigue, they are easily irritable or irritated, and they just forget where they put their keys, and they're just struggling with their brain. Getting into ketosis is a great way, especially once they get keto adapted, which takes a little bit longer from being fat adapted, that's when the mitochondria are really efficient at using those ketones, and that brain fog goes away. It's one of the, if you're an entrepreneur, like, you got to use ketosis, you got to use ancient healing strategies, because it does great things for your brain. I feel amazing when I am in ketosis. When I speak on stages, I'm always fasted. I'm going to get the BDNF. I'm going to get the ketones up. So to answer your question, it does amazing things for brain function.
Yeah. I've always noticed too, whether or not I was eating carnivore or not, just a standard diet. I was always very meat heavy. I never really ate a bunch of processed food and junk, but I always felt better when I was fasted, like if I didn't eat that day, so I always like played rugby games or matches, with like wrestling or fighting, where I would never, ever eat the day of a competition. And the one or two times I did, I was just like, completely regretted it. I was just like, oh my God, that was such a bad idea. I just never felt as good. I just didn't have all the energy that I normally would. And, you can definitely notice that mentally as well. And I know, you mentioned, Dr. Ben Bickman, that's something that he's shown a lot as well, especially to do with Alzheimer's and how that can really, 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 change people's experience with Alzheimer's, and just changing, like Alzheimer's, a lot of people are now calling it type 3 diabetes, because it's really is a metabolic issue, like most other things as well. And you get insulin resistance in the brain as well. And so you're not getting glucose passing as readily. But you switch over to ketosis, and all of a sudden just ketones are running into your brain, which, despite what, a lot of people try to say, that is your brain's primary energy source. I learned that in biochemistry 24 years ago, that like your brain always runs on ketones, always runs on ketones. Doesn't matter what biochemical state you're in. It always runs on some ketones. And then when you get a certain threshold of ketones, even if you have an abundance of glucose, it actually switches over completely to ketones. So, I mean, that to me shows a preference, right? There's more glucose than ketones, but it's choosing the ketones. That's a preference. And so, you switch over to running on ketones, and all of a sudden their brains just wake up, because now their brains are actually getting energy. Now they've been atrophied. The cells have been damaged. So, they're not going to work as well as they did before, but they're going to work as well as they can. Whereas, when they're running on glucose, they're not able to run as well as they can. And you mentioned mitophagy. So the increase in number of mitochondria, which obviously makes a huge effect. And also, Mitogenesis. Yeah. Geez, I got it. Yeah. But there's also mitophagy.
There's also that. Yeah.
Which is like recycling these things. So you get these mitochondria that, that are just sort of falling apart and not really able to function properly. And they recycle them and tune them up and make new ones. And those run more efficiently as well. So you're getting more of them, and the ones that you have work better. So there's this, compounding effect there. That is very interesting and very powerful. Have you read Chris Palmer's book, Brain Energy yet?
No, it's on my list. I'm going to bring him on the show though. Have you read it?
It's really good.
I heard great things.
It's a masterclass on mitochondria and how they work.
Oh, and I can't wait. Yeah.
No, it's fantastic. It's really interesting, especially because it talks about not just how the mitochondria make energy, but how they actually like run around. They're almost like, he talks about them as like workers in a factory. But it really does sound like it's like these, like almost like little like creatures in our body that are like running this huge machine that is our person. And because they actually move around the cell. So it's not that you're just sitting there creating energy. They move to this area, create ATP so that this organelle can function and create like, neurotransmitters and release neurotransmitters. And they go here and they go here and they go here and they go here and they go here. So, and as you say, there can be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of these things in like a neuron or something like that. I mean, how complex is that? That they're just buzzing around doing all these sorts of things, so intricate and so precise. And then when that breaks down a bit, you have, hundreds of thousands of mitochondria not quite working right in 2 trillion neurons. That's a big effect,
That's a problem.
Yeah. And so, obviously, Dr. Palmer saw this in psychiatric issues. He's reversing people's schizophrenia and OCD and major depression by putting them in ketosis, and then getting their mitochondria working better. After about 3 months, you really tune up your mitochondria.
Yeah, that's when they're about keto adapted at that point, right?
Yeah. And so there you go. So that fits, very well with that. And, but yeah, it's very interesting how he lays this out with the mitochondria. They do a lot more than we think. And, I just think it's really cool that they're actually bouncing around and like using these organelles and different parts of our cell, like as machines and like to create different processes. I think it's fascinating.
So fascinating. We once thought like the mitochondria were these like mindless energy factories, and there's an intelligence to the mitochondria, to your point and Chris Palmer's point, like it's moving around. There's also some research from Dr. Robert Navio that shows that there's also an intelligence in the mitochondria, that the mitochondria act as surveillance systems. And when there's too many cellular threats, too much stress, the mitochondria, in order to survive, will actually lower energy production, shut down energy production, and it goes into the cell danger response, the CDR. And that's where chronic fatigue happens, long COVID symptoms happen. It's the mitochondria has seen there's too much stress. And when I say stress, it could be mental, mental stress, chemical stress, toxicity, or physical stress. And that could come from food. It could come from other areas. But when there's too much stress, the mitochondria see that as a threat. In order to survive, it actually lowers or shuts down energy production. That's the intelligence in the mitochondria. And then it gets stuck sometimes and locked into the cell danger response. So when somebody goes through like COVID for 2 weeks and they get really sick, their mitochondria have seen a whole bunch of stress for 2 weeks, and then it gets locked into the CDR response. And then they have COVID symptoms for a year or 2 years. So there is an intelligence there, and we want to make sure the mitochondria feel safe and protected and allow it to do its thing. And ketosis is a big part of that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so much more that we're not, not fully understanding at this point as well.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely. So that just brings us around. So you're in ketosis, you're not getting your energy from carbs. Okay. So where do you get your carbs from? What doesn't saturated fat cause heart disease? Doesn't that cause diabetes and kill you? Things like that.
Yeah, right. It's like, how could that be if our cell membranes, which are so important, are made up of what you just said, saturated fat, cholesterol, and protein? I believe, Anthony, the membrane is actually where the intelligence is. And I've lectured on this, and I believe the membrane, the integrity of your membrane, your cell membrane, is what is going to determine if a gene is turned on or turned off. And I believe that because of Dr. Bruce Lipton's work. He's shown when those integral membrane proteins, the receptor sites, are inflamed or blunted, the good things can't get in, meaning nutrients, oxygen, thoughts, etc. And then the bad things can't get out, meaning free radicals and toxins. So then it sends a signal to the DNA. So the membrane is made up of protein, saturated fat, and cholesterol. So if we're made of that, how could it be bad for us? Our body loves it. It's the building blocks for a healthy membrane and receptor sites. And there's no carbs there. The human body is less than 1% maybe of total carbohydrates, but it's protein and fat and water. That's the name of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember seeing that when I was in 8th grade, life sciences, just like a biology class. And we looked at this picture of the cell, and it had like the molecules and everything like that made up, the lipid bilayer of the membrane.
Yeah.
It is cholesterol, it's like something like 76% is
almost 80%. Yeah.
Yeah. It's cholesterol. I remember looking at that and I was just like, how is cholesterol bad for us? I was like, we are cholesterol. Like, how can it be bad for us? It didn't make any sense to me. But I remember just being a kid. I was like, well, I'm a kid. I don't know everything yet. Like, I'm sure they'll tell me. I'm sure we'll figure this out. But I remember just putting a mental pin in that, and coming back to it. I'm like, God, I'm glad I remember thinking that.
You were right. Your intuition was dead on right there, my friend.
Well, that's the thing too. Sometimes you can see that clearly when you haven't had your mind corrupted through education. That you haven't been. That's what I never understood what the hell people were talking about inside the box thinking, outside the box thinking. It was like, think outside the box. Like, what the hell does that mean? Like, no one ever explained that. Well, I get it now. The box is your sort of your predisposed thoughts. Like you've been taught these are the limits of your world. You have to live within this box, like this is how the body works. Fat is bad, all these sorts of things. And thinking outside the box is assuming that might not be true, as having an open mind and saying, okay, well, what if that isn't true? And then you go outside of that, what happens then? And then you find out a lot of other things, like, well, what if, we were made out of cholesterol? What if that's not actually a bad thing for you? And things change a lot, and, in geometry, it's Euclidean geometry, and he had certain postulates that he couldn't prove mathematically, that like, the three angles of a triangle add up to 180. Right. And he was just like, this happens every time. Like, I can't really prove it mathematically, but I see it all the time. And I'm just going to say, like, this is an assumption. This is where I'm going to base this stuff off of. And then you have non-Euclidean geometry that thinks outside of that box. And you say, well, what if the angles don't add up to 180? What happens then? Right. Really crazy, weird, cool things happen. And they actually describe deep space pretty well, So like, Euclidean geometry is really good down here. But when you start looking at space, it actually starts becoming different. And this is where the idea of space being curved comes in. It's this idea of these triangles, because if you have this angle coming in like this, but you have these 3 points, it has to curve to get to each point. Right.
Yeah.
And so they talk about this. It was like, so being curved is, it comes into that. So non-Euclidean geometry actually is helping people sort of describe the observable universe. So that's that outside of the box thinking. And I think that when you're a kid, you haven't even learned what the hell the box is, so you're always thinking outside the box because you're trying to just figure out what the hell is going on with what you're seeing. And you have an adult saying, oh, no, because of all these things that they've had put into their head. But a kid hasn't had that yet. And that's why I think, that the old phrase, wisdom from the mouth of babes, is because they haven't had their mind boxed in yet and closed in. And so they can actually just think about things. Be like, we're made out of cholesterol. How the hell is cholesterol bad for us? That's a thought that we should all have.
Yeah, a great explanation. Exactly. It's like basic sense. And not only that, I mean, there's zero saturated fat in an included artery. Like there's no saturated fat there. It's saturated fat is so important for the integrity of that lipid bilayer. It's the building blocks for it. But you're so right. There's something to be said about my mentor, Dr. Pompa, always tells me, he goes, the benefit for me being in the health space is that I never had to unlearn, meaning like I never went to medical school. I never had to like learn things that put me in this box or created this box and then get out of that box. It was just directly like curiosity. I'm always just curious, asking questions. So he's like, that's a blessing. You never had to go through that process of having to unlearn what they taught you for so many years in school. So I think about that the way you explained it. Like I never had to create that box for myself. So there was the benefit there for me not going through medical school.
Yeah. Yeah. And learning what the limits are, like you don't want to look at the limits. You don't want to live in the box. You want to think about everything broadly. And I think that's very beneficial. I think one thing that, I've always been just very open-minded. I've always listen to what my teachers said, but also I've always just kept my own sort of counsel. And I always I remember looking back at my old notes from high school and college and, even medical school. And I'd be writing something down. And I'd have a note to myself. I was just like, well, this sounds like bullshit. And here's why. I look this up because I think this is crap, something like that. And I've just sort of seen that enough. And I'm like, okay, well, opinion is also being mixed in with fact here. So I was like, I always sort of just had everything, took everything with a grain of salt. And then thankfully we had one of our professors in medical school said sort of a paraphrase of something that was said at a commencement graduation at Harvard back in like the 30s and 40s, which they said to us, which was everything that you learn here in medical school will be obsolete by the time you graduate. And so you need to stay on top of it. You need to read the literature. You need to stay informed because it will keep moving. And if you just go by what you learn here in medical school, you will already be out of date by the time you graduate. So you always need to be learning and relearning. And what does that mean? That means that our guidelines now are wrong. They're a work in progress. And we have to recognize that. We have to understand that. And some things we're going to get right and some things we're going to get sort of right and they're going to work for a time and then we're going to find something better. So, just having that open-mindedness is very important. And that was what the Harvard graduation address was. They said that in 10 years' time, half of what you learn will be wrong. But no one's going to tell you what half. So you have to keep learning. And so, that's the thing. And so I had that sort of mindset, and that was helped by those professors reiterating that, saying, hey, look, you don't trust everything. These things are going to come back and find out that, they're best effort at the time, but they're not right. And, so it's very disappointing to me when I come across doctors that just get very angry, and a lot of vegan doctors and things like that. And they're talking about the guidelines and this and that and the other. And like, first of all, if you're going by guidelines, you are 10 years behind even the evidence, right? Because it takes years and years and years to get the current evidence that's in the literature into the guidelines, if they ever do get in the guidelines.
Right.
And as a doctor said, a very cutting edge doctor in cystic fibrosis, he was doing a lot of things that weren't even in the literature. And it's in the book, Better by Dr. Atul Gawande, who's like a professor of surgery at Harvard, and wrote really good books, actually very interesting books. His first book, Complications, like the first season of Grey's Anatomy, all the medical stories are directly out of that book. That's why it was that's why it was so interesting, because it was a really, really good book. So he wrote that, and he wrote a couple other books as well, and that were very interesting. And in that one, he was talking to this guy saying, hey, you're doing things that are just very different than what's in the current literature, but you're getting these amazing results. And the guy just sort of laughed and he just said, if you follow evidence-based medicine, you will always be 2 years behind the cutting edge. Like you have to be out there doing something new, knowing the guidelines, but knowing the evidence and knowing what is out there, and then saying, okay, how can I make this better? And then you put out new information and new evidence, and you're the one creating the literature. You're the one creating the evidence that other people follow. But it is someone creating it and someone following it. So you have to sort of decide, are you brave enough to step out and do something new and maybe show a better way?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have so much respect for those who do step out and show another way, because there's something to be said about research that's coming out, looking at studies and all that's very important. But something else that we want to consider is what happens when you actually are in the trenches and you apply it clinically. Do you see the same thing? Do you see something different? And sometimes it's different what you see, because that research could have changed now, but that was 2 years old or whatever it is. So being in the trenches is very important. Some people sit on their pedestal and they're just like writing papers or referencing papers, but they're not working with people and they're not in the trenches. They're not looking at lab works. They're not seeing what's working, what's not working. So I love people who look at the research and actually apply it and then give feedback on the research and then let us know if that's the right approach. It reminds me what you just shared about a quote from Alvin Toffler. He said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and then relearn. That's the new illiterate of the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, that's very good too. Yeah. And, interesting. Yeah. I hadn't heard that before. That's good. Yeah.
From Future Shock. It's an old book. Great quote though. Yeah.
No, that is fantastic. Yeah. I'm conscious of your time, but if you had a minute, I wanted to just get your thoughts on, you talk about like mindset and responsibility and taking ownership for things and how important that is. And I think that sort of ties everything together. You getting your physical health, your mental health, but then what do you do with it? How do you then apply, these things to having a better life and having, a successful life?
Yeah. Mindset is very important. I believe that 95% of our success is going to be from mindset, 5% strategy, because it's estimated, psychiatrists did some studies and they estimate that the average human being has 60,000 thoughts per day, upwards of 60,000 thoughts per day. And they also estimate that 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts from yesterday and 85% of them are negative thoughts. I call it stinking thinking. I learned that from Zig Ziglar. So I always say, if your thinking is stinking, your dreams are shrinking, right? You got to really master those thoughts. But what determines your thoughts is your environment. So first you got to, do an audit on your environment. I always teach my students this. I always tell them to grab a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, a line at the top, and then put people in your life into two different categories. You're going to put the section called chargers and a section called drainers. And then you're going to audit the 5, 10, 15 people that are in your life that are close to you and put them in a different category. If they are charging you up, meaning you have conversations with them and you feel energized, they support you, they root you on, they're your biggest fan, they are true friends and true supporters, you put them on the chargers side of that list. But then you identify the drainers. The drainers are gossiping. They're telling you saturated fat's bad for you, keto is going to kill you, fasting is starvation mode, carnivore is crazy. And you feel drained after you speak to them. You put them on the list for drainer. So once you're clear on that, you do an audit. Then the first step is to spend more time with chargers, less time with drainers. And as you spend time with chargers, naturally it's going to change the thoughts that you think for more positive, loving, abundant thoughts. And it's going to be easier to change those thoughts versus that environment that's very toxic and you're trying to change your thoughts. So change your environment, then help work on your thoughts. And gratitude is a big part of that. I call it vitamin G, Anthony, the strongest vitamin in the world. I wear t-shirts that say vitamin G, get your daily dose, because it's so powerful and it's not woo-woo anymore. There's a lot of great research. Dr. Joe Dispenza has done brain scans on individuals going through his courses, and he had them looking at their brains through a MRI. They're practicing gratitude. He saw that there were 1,200 chemical reactions that took place when they practiced gratitude. He saw dopamine increase, GABA, serotonin, oxytocin, all these amazing feel-good chemicals and hormones, all because they were just in a state of gratitude. So it's a very powerful vitamin G, that if you think about universal law, whatever you feed energy to expands. So if you're feeding energy to what you're grateful for, naturally, you're going to have more things to feel grateful for. But if you're paying attention to things that you hate and that you're angry about, you feed energy to that, you'll get more of that. And there's a part of the brain called the reticular activating system, which is this the size of your pinky. It's in your brainstem, as you know, and it's the selective seeking mechanism of your brain. And thank God for this, because if we didn't have this RAS, reticular activating system, the brain would short circuit, because there's so many stimulations. There's millions of different stimulations from sounds and noises and, well, that's the same thing, sounds and lights and different things going on. And if the brain didn't have this mechanism, the RAS, to filter it all out, we would short circuit. So how this works is, whatever you feed the RAS, you see more of. So if you wanted to buy a red car, a red, let's say Tesla, and you buy a red Tesla, now you see red Teslas everywhere. That's because you've activated the RAS to see them. They were always there. Now you've activated it. So how does this relate to gratitude? Well, when you're in a state of gratitude and doing it consistently, you're going to appreciate more things that you used to be angry about and fearful about. Now you're grateful for, because that's what the RAS is signaled to see. So gratitude is very important. Get your vitamin G every single day, control your environment, and then it's going to make keto, carnivore, fasting, everything else much easier when your environment is under control, because you do become your environment. So mindset is fundamental, just like sleep, just like movement. We want to make sure we're exercising as well as exercising, and it's a big part of what I teach.
That's a really good point, and that's something that I think that people should really take note of. Activating that system, you're going to see more of it. That's going to benefit you in a lot of ways. I think that's probably the benefits of people saying having a positive mindset, like thinking about things positively. You're just going to keep triggering that, and like having gratitude and being grateful for things. A lot of religious teachings are like that. They're just like, hey, look, don't let that stuff in. That's just going to bog you down. That's just going to weigh you down. Just look at the positive things, and you try to get, look at the silver lining on the clouds and all that sort of stuff. I think that's a very, very powerful tool to have, people in a similar, but that's why you see like people in a very similar situation, and one is just taking it so differently, and they're really thriving. And I was like, it's okay. It's not that big of a deal. And they're able to, be much more, they're better able to respond, to negative stimuli in their life, because they're like, yeah, that's okay. We'll figure this out. We'll do this or that. And they're just much better able at navigating life, and they're much happier as a result of it. There are people that you see, and they have really, really, really challenging backgrounds. And, Dr. Palmer, he had a very, very troubled childhood, and, he and his mom were actually homeless for a while, and he worked his way through and become a professor at Harvard, and so he really changed his life around. Other people as well that I've seen, some people, it was funny. I did that show, Reverse. We did like reversing different diseases with carnivore diet, and which we just filmed in Costa Rica, which was awesome. Super cool. We had a lot of the people there, and that was really a great thing. Is meeting people, all in this space that are just really interesting to talk to and hang out with, and having conversations like these they're just great, and you get to do it like all day, and. Dr. Robert Kiltz was there, who's like the most positive guy ever, and he had a really, really, really rough upbringing. He was in, inner city areas. He was, basically homeless for a while. Like his dad was in jail. He was illiterate. Like he couldn't read and write, all these sorts of things. And now he's become an extremely successful person. He has a large chain of fertility clinics. He's obviously very, very, practiced fertility doctor and expert in that field, and very successful. And this guy had we were at this Airbnb and things like that, and there wasn't quite enough rooms or whatever. He's like, I'll just sleep on the floor. It's not that big a deal. This guy's rich. Dude is rich. And he's like, he's got a private jet and a bunch of Porsches. And he's just like, yeah, I'll just sleep on the floor. Nah, it's not that big a deal. I got the biggest room in the house. I got the living room. Oh, this is perfect. He was so positive about it.
I love it.
Yeah. And we were driving in, and we were getting picked up to go to the house we were filming at. And there wasn't much room. And they were like, oh, well, I can come back and pick someone up. He's like, no, it's okay. I'll just hop in the trunk. It's fine. I'm small. I'll fit. And he literally just wedged himself in the back with the luggage, and it just didn't bother him. It just didn't bother him. It's not a big deal. He didn't have this dignity. He's like, oh, I demand more of this. I want luxury, and I'm used to a certain lifestyle. It's none of that, because he just looked at things positive. It's not a big deal. Who cares? I'll sit in the trunk, whatever. We'll get there, and I think that's a clear demonstration of that mindset. And then you have people that, have so much, but they have just such a negative outlook, and then people with so little that have such a positive outlook. And I think that's exactly from doing what you're talking about, and feeding the proper pathways in your brain in the right way. So that's great. That's a great lesson for people to take away.
It's so important. I love Robert. He's great. I didn't know that story though. That story is awesome. What a great guy. I met him in New York City. I was speaking at Keto Symposium. We got to hang out, and he's come on my podcast. He's so great. Nice. I love to hear things like that. But yeah, and it's not woo woo, right? There's science. So people who think your thoughts can't change your life, and we're not just saying just to be a positive thinker, because that's not what we're saying. We're saying as you control your environment and change your environment, it's going to make it easier to be more of a positive person. And when you practice gratitude, it becomes a lot easier, and it's not going to happen over time. I'm somebody who was stinking thinking every single day, negative, hating people, depressed, suicidal. And I'm the complete opposite now. I feel like I'm unstoppable, meaning, I never want bad things to happen to me, but if something happens to me, it's really happening for me, not to me. And that's the difference. People who have a strong mind, mental six-pack, they see everything as happening for them, not to them. And that's what I want for people. But the victim mentality is what we've been fed from our school system and mainstream media. And that's not the way we want to live our lives. We're not a victim. We are the victor of our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. My dad put up a little printed out thing. I'll forget at this point. It was when I was 10, so it was a long time ago. But it was just put it on the fridge in our house. And it says, your thoughts become your words become your deeds become your life becomes your destiny. It starts here with your thoughts. Yeah. And so you have huge control over that. And people do think, oh, it is not, it really makes a difference how you and it's not going to do everything, like you still have to put in the work and things like that, but it's a lot easier to put in work when you have a positive outlook and you look at things like, hey, I know what I can do here. I'll just do this and I'll do this, I'll do this, and things will get better. And you can much more easy to formulate a plan to get yourself out of a bad situation. And when you don't have that, when you have a negative outlook and you just look at everything, well, what's the point? Nothing I do is going to make a difference anyway. I'm stuck here, whatever, for whatever reason, I'm not going to be able to get out of this. So you never try. Like, why would you? And so, you're just stuck into a prison camp, and you're just, like in, oh gosh, I can't remember his name, but
Viktor Frankl.
Yes, exactly that. Yeah. We wrote, talked about his time in the concentration camps, and he talked about the people that had like the negative mindset, like, wow, this is really it. This is going to go. And they couldn't really see beauty in the world anymore. Those are the ones that died. And the ones that survived were the ones that are like, had a mind, like, we're going to get out of this. It's going to be good. And like, one person like sat there for like hours, he was emaciated. He was dying of starvation, but this butterfly landed on his hand. He was just taken by the beauty of this butterfly, and just, he could still see beauty in the world. And there's one guy who, I don't know if this was in the book or another story, but there's a guy who was a composer, and he was composing, symphonies in his head while he was in the concentration camps. And, thankfully he was able to get out of there, and he wrote them down, but he wrote like his masterpieces in his head. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago when he was in the prison camps, the gulags and the prison slave labor camps in the USSR under Stalin. He wrote that whole book in his head while he was there, 2,700 pages. He wrote in his head. And he would recite it back to himself over and over and over again in the prose he wanted. This is why it's such a brilliantly written book. He won a Nobel Prize in literature for that and other works. But it's beautifully written, and it is really one of the great works of literature, and one of the great works of history. This is one of the most important books that's ever been written. And he just recited it over and over to himself. He had rosary beads, like he was praying, but actually it was like, that was how many times he was reciting these passages to himself so that he could memorize this whole thing. And then by the time he got out, that's what his work. He was just writing all this stuff down, writing 2,700 pages, and then getting that out. Just amazing. And so when you have that purpose and that mind, I mean, these guys are in slave labor camps. There's actually, and they're seeing people die and get murdered by the guards all the time. Yeah, you could absolutely be next if you have that defeated sort of mindset. That's sort of it. There was actually one example of that Solzhenitsyn gave, when they were in this like lumber camp, like in Siberia, and like, it was just this crazy conditions. And there's this guy, and it was just like, it was like negative 30 degrees. And there's this guy who was out there, he didn't have a shirt on, just hacking away. And he was just like loving life. And he was just like, the cold didn't get him. The lack of food didn't get him. And he's just like, I love this sort of stuff. If I wasn't in prison, like I'd be doing this anyway. Like, I'm happy. Like, this is great. And he thrived, and he was doing great because he's just like, yeah, this is awesome. I love doing this stuff. So gosh, it makes such a huge difference.
It does. Those are some amazing stories. I didn't know about those last two stories. That's so incredible. Les Brown calls it thermostats versus thermometers, right? A thermometer lets the outside temperature change their internal state, but a thermostat sets their temperature and controls the environment, right? So we want to be more thermostats. Those guys you mentioned, that guy's a thermostat. Those gentlemen are thermostats. They're changing their environment with their internal state.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, I think that's great. I think that's a great place to leave that very positive message that you can absolutely change your life. You can do it. Yeah, people have like the means to change their life nutritionally and also mentally. And I think those are basically 97% of success in a happy life right there. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, Anthony, it was a great conversation, my friend. Thank you for having me, and I can't wait to bring you on my show, brother.
I'm very much looking forward to it. And thank you very much for taking the time. I do really appreciate it. I know we ran a little long, and I appreciate you staying around. Ben, how can people get a hold of you? How can they follow you? How can they find your work?
Yeah, my website is benazadi.com. It has my podcast on there called the Keto Kamp podcast. It has all my social media. There's a contact form too. My book's there as well. So the website's the best place, benazadi.com.
Perfect. Great. Well, we'll put that link up in the show notes as well. And great. Well, Ben, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, brother. I had a blast.
Cool. All right, man. We'll see you later.
Very much for taking the time out to listen to what I had to say. If you like it, then please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel and podcast. And if you're on YouTube, then please hit that little bell and subscribe, and that'll let you know anytime I have a new video out, which should be every week, if not more. And if you could share this with your friends, that would help me get the word out and let me know that you like what I'm doing. Thanks again, guys.